So do you have slides or what? Do you have slides or what today?
Hello, good evening. Welcome to the second lecture of our Princeton Adult School Series, Sex, Gender, and Social Change. I'm Susan Roth. I'm a member of the Adult School Board, and I'm so glad to see you here tonight. Yes, I think it is. Okay, I'll try to project a little more. It's my pleasure to, before I do introduce our speaker tonight, I just wanted to remind everyone that we'll not have a lecture next week, but lectures will resume on October 26th. And tonight, our lecture is The Gender Gap in the 2004 Election. And it's my honor to introduce to you Susan J. Carroll, who is Professor of Political Science and Women's and Gender Studies at Rutgers University and Senior Scholar at the Center for American Women and Politics of the Eagleton Institute of Politics. She is the author of Women as Candidates in American Politics and editor of The Impact of Women in Public Office and Women and American Politics, New Questions, New Directions. She has also published numerous journal articles and book chapters focusing on women candidates, voters, elected officials, and political appointees. She is currently working on an edited volume called Gender and Elections, Change and Continuity through 2004 to be published by Cambridge University Press in 2005. As a nationally recognized expert on women and politics, Carroll is frequently called upon by the media to comment on women's political participation. And in recent weeks, she has been interviewed about women voters for news stories for CNN, National Public Radio, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the Christian Science Monitor, among others. We are very, very lucky to have Sue Carroll with us tonight, and please join me in welcoming her. Well, can you hear me? Yes. Yes. I can hear myself. I want to begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me to speak as part of this very interesting series. It looks like you have a very stimulating lineup of speakers this semester, and I'm delighted to be part of this lineup, although I probably won't be as stimulating as last week, since I'm not going to begin with a photo of Dolly Parton. I heard about that. As you all know, the election is 3 weeks from today. And as a result, what I have to say tonight is certainly very timely. I hope it'll be provocative as well, because I'm really looking forward to a lively exchange after I finish my prepared remarks. I'm going to talk about the role of women and gender in the 2004 elections, and I'm going to focus on women voters because I really believe that what happens with women voters over the next 3 weeks is going to make the difference in this election. Whether women voters, especially those women who are still undecided, become more supportive of Kerry or break towards Bush in the final weeks will decide, I think, whether we as a country stay the course with George W. Bush or whether we move in a different direction with John Kerry. What I really want to do is to provide some evidence to back up my claim that the votes of women may well be decisive in what looks like it will be a very close election, and to suggest some things you might want to pay attention to and watch for with regard to women voters and gender-based appeals during the final 3 weeks of this presidential campaign. You'll probably be relieved to hear I'm not going to be referring to a lot of numbers tonight. After many years, I've finally learned to talk about voting behavior without using a lot of data, which has required a lot of resocialization since I was a quantitatively trained political scientist. But for those of you who are like me and you really do like data, I'd like to encourage you, if you haven't already, to pick up the handouts that are available out on the table outside.
you know, as you or they were available as you can come in. These are fact sheets that we have produced at the Center for American Women in Politics, with which I'm affiliated at Rutgers University. And our center is really the major data collection place in the country in terms of women's participation in American politics, and a major source of information for media, for activists, for a whole variety, political women themselves, for a whole variety of people who are interested in women in politics. So if you are at all interested, the other thing I'll say is that on the piece of paper, the other reason it's worth picking up is because our website, the address for our website is listed on that sheet of paper. And if you're someone who is interested in women in politics, I invite you to visit our website, because we have tons of information, both historical and current, about women in politics on the website. To set the context for talking about this election, I want to begin by talking very briefly about the history of women voting in this country. And one of the interesting tidbits that I've learned about women's voting history that I bet at least some of you in this room are not aware of is that women in New Jersey, at least some women in New Jersey, actually had the right to vote back before 1920, before the suffrage amendment was added to the U.S. Constitution. New Jersey wrote its first constitution in 1776, and unlike the other 12 colonies, which explicitly restricted voting to men, New Jersey's constitution gave the right to vote to, quote, all inhabitants of this colony who are worth 50 pounds and have resided within the county for 12 months, end quote. In other words, there was no mention of gender whatsoever, sex whatsoever. Now, there's some disagreement about whether omitting women in this language was intentional or whether it was merely a mistake. And really, not that many women were able to vote anyway. I mean, the vote was basically limited to property women, women who had property, and of course, women who were married did not have property in their own name. So that really meant widows and single women who owned property specifically. However, even though there weren't very many women who were able to vote, unfortunately, even a few women voting was just too much for New Jersey to bear. And after 30 years of letting women vote, some politicians in New Jersey decided that they didn't like how they thought women were voting, because of course they didn't have any real way to ascertain how women were voting. And so the vote for women was taken away in 1807 when the legislature passed a bill denying women the right to vote in the state. While a few property single women were able to vote in colonial New Jersey, most women in this country didn't get the right to vote until the 19th Amendment was added to the Constitution in 1920. And as we know, it took 7 or 8 decades of struggle for women to gain the right to vote. I don't know how many of you have seen the HBO movie called Iron Jawed Angels about the last few years of the suffrage movement. But that movie really focuses on Alice Paul, who was, as many of you probably know, was born here in New Jersey, a native in New Jersey, and the more militant part of the suffrage movement. These were the women who chained themselves to the White House fence, were imprisoned, and force-fed. And for a commercial movie shown on HBO, I mean, it did have sort of a silly romance, I think, that they felt that they had to put in there. But for a commercial movie shown on HBO, it was really quite an interesting and important movie, I think. So if you get a chance to see it, either because it comes back around on HBO, it was playing last winter, but if it comes back around on HBO, or if you can get it at your video store, I hope you don't pass up the chance to see it. I teach a lot, well, I teach at least some young folks at Rutgers, and I think the young people that I teach at least really don't have any idea what these women gave up in order to give us the right to vote, or for women to get the right to vote. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton devoted their whole lives to gaining suffrage for women, and yet they died before women were enfranchised. And I tell my students that my goal, and talking with them about the suffrage movement and women getting the right to vote, is not only to get them to vote, but also to make them feel guilty every time they don't vote, knowing that so many struggled so hard for something that they take for granted. Anyway, the suffrage campaign that led to the addition of this amendment to the Constitution built up a lot of hopes and expectations about women's vote. Over the course of the several decades that it took to win the right to vote, suffragists used a variety of arguments to win support from different segments of the all-male electorate and political structure. And some of the most effective arguments focused on how women were different from men and would use their votes to help to make the world a better place. Suffragists argued that women's experiences, especially their experiences as mothers and as caregivers in society, gave them special values and perspectives that would be readily apparent in their voting decisions. And suffragists argued that women would use their votes to stop wars, promote peace, clean up government, ban the sale of liquor, and bring justice to a corrupt world. Well, the use of some of these arguments, as you can imagine, led some people to greatly anticipate women's voting and others to greatly fear the consequences of women's enfranchisement. Many observers at the time expected women to flock to the polls and for their distinctive impact on politics to be immediately apparent. As we all know, nothing like this happened right after women were given right after women achieved. They weren't given. They achieved the right to vote. Instead, women voted in much lower numbers than men, and there were no clear signs that they were voting much differently than men, or using their votes to express any kind of distinctive perspective. Although women turned out to vote at much lower rates than men in the presidential elections immediately following suffrage, over the decades the gap between women's and men's rates of voter turnout narrowed until finally in the 1980 presidential election, women caught up with men. Since 1980, women have actually turned out to vote at a higher rate than men in every presidential election. Women not only vote at a slightly higher rate than men, but as we all know, they also are a slightly larger proportion of the population. And when you put these two facts together, what it means is that there have been a lot more female than male voters in recent elections. In the 2000 election, for example, about 7.8 million more women than men voted. And this year there's been an unprecedented effort by several different organizations to register and mobilize women who haven't voted in previous elections, just as I think there have been unprecedented efforts to register all kinds of people in this election. Perhaps the most visible of the women's efforts has been an effort by an organization called Women's Voices, Women's Vote, which has targeted the 22 million single women, what they call women on their own, who did not vote in the 2000 presidential election. Now, this is a nonpartisan effort, but there's no doubt, or there's very little doubt, that the women who are being registered in this effort are far more likely to vote Democratic than they are Republican if they vote at all. That may be the big question. The feminist majority and other groups have been out there registering women in record numbers on college campuses, and college-age women also lean Democratic. But there have been efforts on the right as well. Evangelical churches seem to have been engaged in unprecedented mobilization efforts this year, encouraging people to register, and many of these people will, as you can imagine, vote for Bush. And this mobilization effort has probably affected more women than men, since women are more religious, and consistently surveys show they're more religious in this country, and they're more likely to attend church services. Anyway, if these voter registration and mobilization efforts aimed exclusively or disproportionately at women voters are even somewhat effective, I think it's reasonable to assume that, or expect that at least 8 million more women than men will vote in 2004. And the fact that women outnumber would undoubtedly outvote men is one of the reasons that I believe women's votes will be decisive in this presidential election, especially if it's a close election, which it surely is looking like it's going to be. A second reason I think women's votes will be decisive in the upcoming election is because of something we call the gender gap. Women not only vote at a higher rate than men, they vote differently than men. They have different political preferences. As the decades passed following the addition of the suffrage amendment to the Constitution in 1920, it seemed that the vote, the women's vote that the suffragists envisioned, was never going to materialize. Decade after decade passed, and there was no clear indication that women were expressing different preferences or voting differently than men. They split their votes between the two parties about the same as men did in most elections. In fact, my fellow political scientists had an explanation. They thought there was an easy explanation for why women in the aggregate seemed to vote like men in the aggregate, why their choices looked alike, even though they didn't have a lot of good data to back it up. And that was simply that women were merely voting like their husbands. There's a great Andy Capp cartoon that I have on my bulletin board, and as well as on my computer, that I think shows all too well the problems with this explanation. As you know, Andy Capp is a British cartoon, so the parties there are Labour and Conservative rather than Democratic and Republican as in this country. But in this particular cartoon, a pollster comes up and knocks on the door of the Capp residence, and Flo, Andy's wife, answers the door. And the pollster asks her the question, says to her, who are you going to vote for in the upcoming election? Are you going to vote for the Labor Party or the Conservative Party? And Flo says to the pollster, wait a minute. And you see her in the next frame, she turns and she bellows up the stairs, Andy, who are you going to vote for in the upcoming election? And the voice comes back down the stairs, Labor, and Flo turns to the pollster and says, Conservative. Well, clearly I think cartoonists understand family dynamics a lot better than political scientists. But even if wives weren't always voting the way their husbands wanted them to, and I suspect they often weren't, nevertheless it is true that in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, women and men in the aggregate were making similar voting choices. Then along came Ronald Reagan in the 1980 election, and the whole picture changed. It was really during the presidency of Ronald Reagan that we first began to notice the kinds of gender differences in voting and political preferences that the suffragists had anticipated, although not really imbued with the same kind of moral whatever that they had imbued them. What we have come to call the gender gap, and by that I mean a significant difference in the proportion of women and the proportion of men voting for any given candidate. The gender gap was evident for the first time in the 1980 presidential election. In that election, exit polls showed that women were 6 to 9 percentage points less likely than men to vote for Ronald Reagan. In every subsequent presidential election, there have been similar gender gaps in the proportion of women and the proportion of men who voted for the winning candidate, ranging from a low of 4 percentage points in 1992 to a high of 11 percentage points in 1996. And of course, in every presidential election since 1980, women have been more likely than men to support the Democratic candidate. The same pattern is apparent so far in the 2004 presidential race, contrary to some of the misleading press coverage that might have suggested otherwise. There have been some stories that said a couple weeks ago that the gender gap disappeared. Simply not really true. Polls conducted over the past several months have shown, with very few, if any, exceptions, that women are several percentage points more likely than men to favor John Kerry. And similarly, support for George W. Bush is higher among men than among women. Women like Kerry better than men do, men like Bush more than women do. Okay, what underlies this gender gap? Why are women in this race and other presidential elections since 1980 more likely than men to support the Democratic candidate? I want to identify a couple of more general factors that I think are at work, and then take a look at how the major issues in the 2004 race are affecting the dynamics of the gender gap. Let me start with the more general factors. First, let me say that there is no simple explanation for the gender gap. Political scientists have done all kinds of analysis, we've cranked through all kinds of data. There just isn't one simple explanation. Having said that, even though you can't point to one simple issue or explanation, if I was really pressed and really had to, the one thing that I would point to that I think may be most critical in explaining why we have seen a gender gap over the past 2 decades would be that women and men in the aggregate now have fundamentally different views about the role of government. In recent years, some of the most consistent and important gender differences in public opinion have shown up on questions about the role which government should play in our lives. Both women and men seem to agree that government, especially the federal government, is not working particularly as effectively, certainly not as effectively as they would like. However, they disagree on what to do about the ineffectiveness of government, to greatly oversimplify the differences. Men are more likely to want to cut back on government, to downscale the size and role of government. This is men in the aggregate. Women in the aggregate want to fix it. Men are more likely than women to see government as a problem rather than the solution. Women are more worried than men that government cutbacks in social services may go too far. Women are more concerned than men about preserving the social safety net in this country. So far, debates about the role of government have not received much attention in this election, but I would argue this difference in the views of women and men about the role of government and the federal government operates in the background, much as computer programs often are open and operating in the background when you turn on your computer, even though you're not using them or even aware of them at the moment. This is particularly true when the discussion turns to domestic issues. Thus, you see women more concerned than men, more in favor than men, of the federal government doing something to deal with the healthcare crisis, to improve public education, and to ensure that people will have adequate resources when they retire. As a second factor, a general factor, setting the context for gender differences in this election, women are also much more likely than men to be worried about the future of the country. Just as an example, one example, a Washington Post ABC News poll conducted at the end of September, just a couple weeks ago, found that a majority, 55% of women among registered voters, compared with only 43% of men, that's a 12 percentage point difference, are dissatisfied, quote, with the way things are going in the United States at this time, end quote. And on a variety of different measures like this that have been included in recent polls, women appear more pessimistic than men about the country's future. Now, turning to the issues that are most central to this particular election, recent polls suggest that 3 sets of issues are paramount on the forefront of voters' minds, and this is true for women and men. And these issues won't surprise you because we've all been hearing a lot about them. The first is the war in Iraq, the second is terrorism and national security, and the third is the economy, especially jobs. In fact, I saw a recent national poll where roughly 1/3 of voters said that each of these 3 sort of clusters of issues was the one that was most important to them in this election. So the point I'm trying to make is that all 3 of these issues are critical. The dynamics surrounding these 3 issues are contributing to the gender gap in this election, and they also help to explain the shifts we have seen with women voters. As you know, this is the first election since 1980 that foreign policy has been central to a presidential campaign. And you'll remember 1980 was the election where hostages were being held in Iran, and this was the Carter-Reagan election. And of course, 1980 was the election where the gender gap first appeared. In 1980, there was evidence that Ronald Reagan's tough macho posture on foreign policy and his desire to build a strong national defense elicited different reactions from women and men, and was important in explaining why he received stronger support from men than from women. And in fact, one of the most persistent and long-standing political differences between women and men that shows up in polls is in their attitudes toward the use of military force. For as far back as we have public opinion polling data, women have been significantly more likely than men to oppose the use of force to resolve international conflicts. And this gender difference, as you might expect, has been evident in women's and men's attitudes toward the current war in Iraq. Polls have consistently shown a gender gap, with women having more reservations than men about our involvement there. While women are more critical than men of our involvement in Iraq, they also show important and interesting differences from men in their views on terrorism and homeland security. We've heard a lot of talk in the media lately about so-called security moms, or at least I who talk to the media have heard a lot of talk lately about security moms. Supposedly, these are married women with children, usually white married women, they're usually assumed to be white married women with children, who are preoccupied with worrying about security and terrorism, and who many commentators have pointed to as the people responsible for the upsurge in the polls for George W. Bush following the Republican convention. According to media accounts, these are this year's swing voters, comparable to the soccer moms we heard about back in 1996 and 2000. These are the women who could decide the outcome of this election. And what I have to say about all of this is hogwash. There are a couple of key critical differences between these 2 social constructions of voters called soccer moms and security moms. And I refer to them as social constructions because they don't exist as real identifiable groups in our society. There aren't any interest groups out there claiming to represent the interest of soccer moms or security moms, which I might say is very convenient for the campaigns. And people don't run around saying, watch out for me, I'm a security mom and I vote. But anyway, the main differences between soccer moms and the security moms, you know, these 2 constructions, is that the soccer moms talked about in 1996 and 2000, as they were portrayed by pollsters and reporters, lived in the suburbs and they were swing voters. They could go either way, Democratic or Republican. In contrast, the security moms aren't tied to a geographic location. They live in rural areas and small towns as well as in the cities and suburbs, and most importantly, they don't swing. A majority of these women vote Republican, and there's little that Kerry could do to persuade most of these women to vote for him. In fact, white married women with children are one of the most heavily Republican-leaning groups of women in the electorate. Evangelical women may be the only other group of women who vote more Republican than do white married women with children. Now, white married women with children are less Republican than white married men with children. There is a gender gap among among those who are white, married, and have children. But white married women with children are still more conservative and more Republican than most other women. These women didn't swing towards George W. Bush after the convention during the time the Republicans quite successfully focused attention on national security. Rather, these women were already in the Bush camp. What happened after the Republican convention is that the entire electorate, both women and men, moved in a pro-Bush direction. The pendulum swung strongly toward Bush, and as we have seen, it's now started swinging back in the other direction, so that the race again appears almost dead even, with voters very evenly divided between the two candidates and their preferences. Despite the fact that I don't think too much of the idea of security moms as swing voters who are likely to affect the outcome of this election, I do believe women think differently about terrorism and homeland security than men do. Recent polls have shown a couple of very interesting gender differences. One is that when men are asked about terrorism and whether they're worried about terrorism, what you find is that men who live in the big cities are far more worried than men who live outside the big cities. In other words, they're concerned about terrorism. The concern of men about terrorism seems to be primarily confined to men who live in big cities. This isn't true for women. Women are worried about terrorism regardless of where they live. And equally as interesting, women are more than twice as likely as men to be concerned that a member of their own family may be the victim of a terrorist attack. But here's the rub. While women express greater concern about terrorism than men do, women are not significantly more likely than men to say that terrorism is an issue that will determine their choice of presidential candidates. In other words, security is an issue that helps and benefits George Bush. When voters are more focused on this issue than the economy or the war in Iraq, as they were following the Republican convention with its strong focus on the terrorism issue, Bush does better. When voters are focused on security and terrorism, Bush does better with voters in the polls. But he does better with both women and men, not just with women. The economy is also a central issue for voters in this election, and it is quite important to women voters and an issue that is critical to the gender gap. Just as women are worried about homeland security, they are also worried about economic security. Women feel more economically insecure than men, which is not surprising when you consider the fact that almost 2/3 of minimum wage workers are women, that women have less money saved for retirement than men do, and that women are more likely than men to have households living below the poverty line. Women are very concerned that the middle class in this country is being squeezed economically. They see families having difficulty making ends meet. They see the quality of jobs declining. They worry about the cost of health care and whether they will have enough money for retirement. White married women, who tend to be better off economically than other women, tend to vote Republican, as I mentioned before, and are pretty solidly pro-Bush. And by the way, I think they're pro-Bush because of their economic circumstances, their economic situation, not because of what Jon Stewart said was the reason. I don't know if any of you heard this, but Jon Stewart said that married women are voting for Bush Cheney because, after all, married women are used to being lied to by men. An interesting explanation, but I don't think the right one. But for a majority of other women, unmarried white women and women of color, their economic concerns align them pretty clearly with the Democratic Party and lead them to tend to support Democratic candidates. Just as the focus on security issues is likely to advantage Bush and increase his support among women, Kerry is likely to benefit from a focus on economic issues. To the extent that he can get women voters to focus more on the state of the economy and less on security, Kerry is likely to benefit. Okay, let me talk a little about what all this means for the strategies we may see the two presidential candidates employing in tomorrow night's debate and the last 3 weeks of the campaign. First, I suspect we will continue to see the display of what I would consider to be hyper-masculinity on foreign policy issues that we've been witnessing from both candidates throughout this election. Both women and men seem to be looking for a strong leader, sort of the great macho father, who will hunt down and kill terrorists wherever they are and protect the country. Even though the candidates aren't talking about women or men when they talk about the war in Iraq and terrorism, there is no doubt that what they're saying is totally gendered. They're trying to outperform each other when it comes to masculinity, whether it is George Bush saying that he will not waver, or George Bush refusing to admit that he has ever made any mistake as president, or John Kerry saluting and saying that he's reporting for duty. Bush will do his best to keep the focus on security, since that is where he has the advantage over Kerry with women and with voters overall. The Bush campaign will undoubtedly keep trying to link the issues of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, 9/11, and Al-Qaeda, because Bush will fare better if people subordinate the war in Iraq to terrorism and security and see it all as part of the same struggle. I read a very alarming statistic last week, that women are more than twice as likely than men in this country to believe that Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11. And I actually believe that statistic. The reason I do is because research has generally found that women pay less attention to politics and they have less knowledge about national politics than men do. Obviously, so I think that is a real statistic, despite all the evidence that's come out to the contrary, separating the two and saying there really has been no association. Obviously, Kerry's strategy needs to be to break apart this association between Iraq and the war on terrorism, to insist that they are two separate struggles. He needs to reassure women that he will protect the country, but I think security will remain an issue that works to Bush's advantage through Election Day. Consequently, Kerry would do well to try to keep voters focused more on Iraq and the mistakes he insists Bush made there than on security, even though Kerry doesn't have the kind of strong advantage we know on the war issue he would have if he were not perceived as having been so inconsistent on Iraq. I think Kerry's strongest shot is to try to get voters more focused on domestic issues, where he has an advantage in the polls over Bush. Tomorrow night's debate, like George Bush, I think they're internets and debates. Tomorrow night's debate gives him an opportunity to try to do that. I don't know if you noticed in the last debate, but in his concluding comments, Kerry referred to the middle class squeeze. That wasn't accidental. I think we will hear language like that used again, because it is definitely language that that pollsters who are conducting focus groups have found that women positively respond to. We should hear a lot of talk from him about health care. When he speaks about it, he'll be speaking disproportionately to women, because women care more about this issue than men do. Not that men don't care about it. Women just give it greater priority. Some pollsters even insist that health care is the #1 economic issue for women. I also heard Kerry mention equal pay in the last debate, which initially sort of astounded me, because I don't really think of equal pay as an issue that's likely to resonate with a lot of voters out there. It's more sort of like something you think of as a part of the feminist agenda. But apparently, what people I know who have been pollsters that have been polling women tell me, and doing focus groups with women, undecided women in particular, tell me, is that voters, the undecided women voters, are in fact concerned about equal pay. And they're concerned about equal pay because the burden of supporting their family falls very heavily now on them. And because they have to bear such a share for supporting the finances, supporting their families financially, they want to be paid more. They want to be paid equally with men. So it will be interesting to see if Kerry again makes reference to equal pay. I think the biggest challenge for Kerry is going to be to talk about economic and domestic issues in a way that connects with women's lives. The pollsters I know have been talking to women voters this year say that women look for themselves and those they love in the statistics and messages that candidates give out. They want to know that candidates understand their lives and their struggles. The challenge for Kerry will be to bring macroeconomic issues down to the level of the kitchen table, to talk to women in real terms that relate to their lives. Frankly, I think it's likely that Bush may end up being better at this than Kerry is. And after all, so far, Bush is connected to people better. At least that's what the polls show. And Bush's challenge, I think, in tomorrow night's debate, as far as women are concerned, is to speak to the women in his base and to shore up their support. He's not going to win a majority of women voters, most likely. But he does have women in his base, and he needs to hold on to them. These are small business owners, evangelicals, and white married women, just as three main groups. Bush is likely to talk about small business, and we will undoubtedly hear from him once again about preserving life, in other words, about his position on the abortion issue, since these issues resonate well with the women who tend to support him. I could go on and on, but I want to hear your comments and questions. So just let me end here by reiterating something I was recently quoted as saying in an article in the Washington Post. According to the Washington Post reporter, I said, quote, Kerry has to get women and he has to get them in a sizable majority. If he loses women, he will lose this election. It's as simple as that, end quote. And yes, I do think it's sort of as simple as that. I do think women voters will decide this election. Women are a disproportionate share of the undecided voters, somewhere around 60%. And more women traditionally make their voting decisions during the last few weeks and days of the campaign. These women among the undecideds will most likely determine who wins this election. Based on past elections and recent polls, men are going to go overwhelmingly for Bush. We pretty much know that. Women will most likely go for Kerry. But the question is, by how much? And the answer to that question, I would maintain, lies the outcome of this election. Thank you very much. And now the fun part, Kerry, for you. Comment. Oh, yes.
I have a question about reproductive rights. You hinted at it at the end when you were talking about Bush and preserving life. And I was just wondering how much reproductive rights and those types of issues sway women, because it seems like mostly women vote for Democrats and not Republicans, and I know that most Democrats are pro-life, including Kerry. I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Well, Kerry's pro-choice.
Pro-choice. I'm
Pro-choice.
sorry. I'm sorry, I got confused.
Yeah.
I meant pro.
Yeah. I know what you meant. Well, you know, this is sort of a chicken and egg thing. If you look at the polls, abortion or choice or life, whatever you want to call it, doesn't rise very high in terms of voter priorities. But the reason I think it's a chicken and egg thing is it really depends on how much emphasis candidates give to the issue. And this is a choice. This is an issue that, for the most part, you could see Kerry struggling with it in the last debate, right? He doesn't really want to talk about this issue. He's not very comfortable with it, and that has tended to be true in national politics. I don't think Bush wants to talk about it too much either, except when he's talking to his base. He'll talk about it to his base, to some audiences, but you know, I think they both prefer if that question was never asked. Now, I think there are certain segments, of the electorate. There seem to be fewer voters this year, apparently, who are single-issue voters on that issue than there have been in the past. And those single-issue voters tend more to be pro-life than they are pro-choice. There are voters for whom this is an important issue. They tend to be actually, this is motivating, or this issue rises to a higher level for young women, for college-age women, for example. College-age women are more concerned about the abortion issue than other, women who are older. I think probably for, obvious reasons. But, so it has a little more impact with them. And that issue is very important, I think, while it's not very important, I think, in terms of how people are going to end up voting in this election, or voting in most elections, unless the candidates make it an issue, unless there's a clear choice between the candidates and they choose to make it an issue in their campaigns. But it's a very important mobilizing issue. It's very important for the activists who are involved around the issue, the party activists in both parties. There are many party activists in both parties for whom this issue is like a very, very, very critical issue. And so it serves an important, it's certainly vitally important that way, but it's not, it just doesn't register much at the moment on the scale of things that voters are thinking about in terms of how they're going to decide this election for most voters. Yes?
What about some of the newer immigrant groups, women, members, Hispanic, Asian Americans? How do they vote? And also, what about the gun issue? At some point, they talked about Gore having lost the election because he lost one of the gun control
Yeah.
voters.
Well, most people of color in this country vote fairly heavily Democratic. Certainly true for African Americans, African American women and men, for Latinos, with the exception of Cubans, who tend to vote more Republican. Asian Americans, I haven't really looked at the data as closely on Asian Americans, but I think that they tend more in the Democratic direction as well, maybe not quite as heavily. Recent immigrants, I think the issue with recent immigrants is they're going to show up in the people who, if they're newly registered, who are among these unmobilized. This may end up being the story. This potentially, I think, could be the story of this election too, even though I say women are decide the outcome. And women would be part of that. I think part of the outcome of this election could be, in part of this election could be decided, it may surprise us because there's been, I think, so many newly registered voters. The big question is that have never voted before, and unprecedented numbers as far as I can tell. And from what I'm hearing from people across the country, seemingly on both the left and the right. But you know, so if those people turn out to vote, if they're either mobilized you know, because they really want to get rid of Bush, or they want to vote for Kerry, or vice versa, or because they, you know, or because they're mobilized by the parties or by some independent groups to turn out to vote, you know, they may actually end up being the big story of this election. And we may be fooled by the polls. I mean, I think that there's a potential. I mean, the polls usually turn out to be pretty close, pretty accurate. But I think they're not measuring these folks at all. In fact, these people are all getting screened out. Newly registered voters are getting basically screened out of these polls, because when they report these polls, they're reporting likely voters. One of the main criteria for being a likely voter is that you voted in a past election. So the newly registered people aren't even like showing up in these poll results. So I think there is a potential. I don't know if it'll happen, but there is a potential for us to be surprised, I think. And you know, the new immigrants may be, the newly registered immigrants may be part of that surprise. Well, I mean, we'll just have to see. Oh, gun control. You know, it's surprisingly not been much of an issue in this election. It'll be interesting to see if it comes up in the debate. That's certainly an issue that resonates with, you know, it resonates in the same way that security does with a lot of women voters, and with some of the same women voters, you know, that security does. Because again, it's a concern for, to some degree, it's a concern for protecting children. With a lot of the episodes of gun violence that we had, for example, in schools. So it will be very interesting. It's not been a very salient issue in the election, but it will be interesting to see if it comes up in the debate and if it has any kind of impact. I'm surprised it hasn't been more of an issue actually than it has been. Yes?
I want to kind of understand the gap a little bit more, in the sense that there are other gaps. There's in terms of race,
Yes.
in terms of income, and those are all, I mean, women are skewed to some extent towards the bottom of the income level.
Right.
Also, more, as I see from these statistics, there's a bigger gap in terms of the number of women that vote in minority communities that also tend to vote Democratic. It seems that would drive at least some portion of the gap.
Yes.
As opposed to it really being gender. It's more, it can be race, it can be socioeconomic.
Yeah, you can look at this either way, because what you find is that that's right. You can certainly, there are all these gaps, you know, other kinds of gaps. There's been a lot of focus in this election. There was a focus earlier on the marriage gap. People saying it's really the marriage gap. It's the difference between single people and married people that's important, not necessarily the gender gap. You know, the other way to look at that, yeah, so those gaps are, you know, you can talk about those gaps, and those gaps are important. Certainly racial gaps are important, income gaps are important, all those.
Yeah,
But
my question though is it seems that some of those gaps specifically
can account
for some of the
yeah,
gender.
okay, that's what I want to address. That, you know, they can't account for some of it, they can't account for all of it. And the reason is because if you cut the electorate demographically, almost any group you look at, just as I said, if you look at white married men with children and white married women with children, you'll find a gender gap. If you take African American men and African American women, in the last presidential election, for example, there was a gender gap. There was a difference in the way they voted, with the women being more Democratic than the men. You know, so if you take almost any group, income group, age group, racial group, and ethnic group, what you'll do is you'll be able to find a gender gap within that group. So it's not a full explanation. You can't say the gender gap is the result of income or race. It seems to be something that transcends those other characteristics, even though, you know, they all interact with each other.
having said what you just said, what explains the gender gap? I mean, I know black women, white women, forget all these characteristics other than men and women. Why do women vote Democratic more than men do? Why do men vote Republican more than women?
I think it's the well, you know, it's the issues, but the issues are rooted in differences in women's and men's lives structurally. So part of it, some of it is economic, you know, the economic location of women, so that women, for example, are more likely to be at the bottom of the economic structure. They're more likely to be single heads of households, for example, living in poverty than men are. So there are those structural factors, but there are also things that have to do, I think, with there are also things that have to do with there's a gender or a feminism or a something factor as well. For example, if you take people who are in professional and managerial positions who are well educated, you will find that women and men differ politically in their views. So women and men who have the same, who are doing very well economically, who are very well educated, nevertheless don't see the world politically exactly the same way. So it's a complex, I don't know. I mean, I'm not giving you a very good answer because I don't think there is a single answer. Some of it's rooted in structural and economic factors, but there's something psychological as well, having to do with the women's movement and the way it's changed the way that it's changed the consciousness of the women and the way that they see themselves and their interest as being independent of those of men. And they size up their interest and look at their lives and make decisions independently. So I think there's a sort of a psychological.
To me, I think the one single bottom line factor is transcending race, transcending economics. Women want more government than men. And the Democrats represent more government.
Women are more into nurturing.
Well, but they do. But part of the reason that women are more in favor, and I pointed that out, that women tend to be less critical of federal government, but they're also more likely to be the recipients of federal government programs, and they're more likely to be the professionals who work in government providing social services. So, so there's also, it has to do with their lives and where they're situationally located. So, I don't know if the explanation, I mean, how far back do we take the explanation? Is it, yes, they do have different attitudes about government, but there also are reasons, structural reasons, situational reasons that they have different attitudes that have to do with their lives. But I don't think the structural and situational alone can sufficiently explain it. I think there also is this indirect effect of the women's movement in changing consciousness, that even when women think, they're not feminist, they nevertheless, their worldview is different than it would have been in the 1950s. Yes?
Yeah, I would say that the divorce rate's about 50%, and women bear the biggest brunt in divorces.
Yeah,
and
that's
the government
factor
has
two.
become the husband. Think of that. So, when they're divorced and they have nothing,
They fall back on the
who
government,
gets the
right.
apartment, who gets the food stamps? So it's a surrogate husband. So they're always looking at the government as a husband.
Or as
something like that.
a place of last resort, right?
Absolutely. And I would say that's why women are going to vote Democrat.
Yeah, I think that's another factor in all of this. Yes.
Has anyone been able to pinpoint a difference in the way men and women respond to poll takers? Are women less willing to speak to poll takers? Are they less willing to speak out? Are they more reticent? Is there a difference there?
I don't know that they're less willing to speak to them. I do know that women more often give don't knows to questions, and some of that seems to be, some of that, when it comes to at least a political knowledge, it may be truly that they don't have, they don't pay as much attention to politics, don't have as much political knowledge of national level politics. But some of it, I think, is that men are less willing to say they don't know. So men guess. It looks like it's some combination of both. So there's some differences that way. I don't know of anything in terms of women women, I have never seen any research in terms of women being more or less willing to speak to pollsters. There may be such stuff, I just don't know about it, yeah. Yes?
Another polling question. Are pollsters oversampling this year to overcome the cell phone and caller ID gap?
Boy, you know,
Or is that a myth?
no, I don't think that gap is a myth at all. I think it's a serious problem for polling. And this is another way, this is another way in which I think we could be fooled by this election, because there's been all this effort to register young folks. And they're not in these polls because they walk around, you know, they don't have landlines, right? They have cell phones.
Well, even people with landlines have caller ID, and
Right.
people aren't taking.
No,
calls.
it's a
And then
serious.
now it's 20 minutes.
It's a very serious problem. I don't know enough about the specifics of, you know, how various survey research firms are going about adjusting for that to be able to answer that really well. But it's a very serious problem, I think, for survey research. And actually, survey research is trying to make a transition to the internet, which has its own problems. You know, so that now there are these attempts to kind of try to survey people over the internet. And, you know, I mean, I have all kinds of reservations about that, but they're working on trying to, I think we're going to see a transition from telephones to the internet in survey research. I don't know when that will happen or how, but I think it's clearly on the horizon. I mean, it's clearly in the works. But there are very, very serious problems, I think, in reaching people. And of course, people who are underrepresented are the people who aren't home, also the people who aren't home because they're working 2 jobs. You know, they're just never home. You know, so there's a real class bias that gets reached as well. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about the newly registered group, or people who haven't voted before, anything that we know about why they didn't vote before, and what's motivating them at this point, and what their characteristics might be?
I don't know a lot about that. That's a really interesting study. I mean, I hope somebody does that study to take a look at people who've registered this year. You know, we know some about why people, we know some about why people haven't registered in the past. We know less about why they're registering, I think, this year, although they may be related. They haven't registered, they haven't registered in the past. I mean, it's a combination of, people feeling like it doesn't matter. 2000 may have had some effect on people, in that respect, but that it doesn't matter, that one vote doesn't make a difference, that they can't affect any change, low efficacy, what we call in political science efficacy, low efficacy, political efficacy. People just being turned off by politics, alienated from politics, feeling like politicians aren't talking about their lives, which I think there are a lot of people out there who have every right. If you are a woman who's like, for example, has been on welfare, maybe on welfare now, is really struggling. Is anyone in this election talking to you? No. I mean, I think there are people, a lot of people out there for whom, the issues that they're most concerned with simply are not being addressed, and they aren't going to be addressed in this election, or most elections, because they've already been written off by candidates as unlikely to vote. And if you're unlikely to vote, this is what I always tell students. Students say, well, they don't pay attention to my issues. And, this, again, they're not going to pay attention to your issues till you vote. Because, because candidates write off students. Why should they pay attention to students when students, you look at the figures, the rate of voter turnout for young people is atrocious. I mean, absolutely atrocious. And unless this election surprises us, in most elections it has been. So, why politicians are going to pay attention to those who are most likely to vote. So students don't get paid attention to. So there are a lot of people out there. I don't know, but it'll be I think it would be a really interesting study to see, and I know someone will do it, to look at people who are voting for the first time this year. And, and what in particular has motivated them. Whether it is the 2000 election, whether it is the stark choice that's seemingly being offered, the starker choice this time, whether it's just the gravity of the circumstances, whether it's just that, people are being motivated by hatred of one candidate or another, more than by liking of one candidate or another. It'll be very interesting. Yes.
I have to
unemployment policies, which were really devised to help men. I mean, they've come increasingly to help women. Barbara, you know a lot more about this than I do, but, but, you know, yeah. I mean, there were parts of the welfare state itself which actually were devised basically to benefit men. Let's come down here.
I wonder what you think about, some women are very interested in getting women candidates in. I've contributed, for example, to Emily's list, yet,
Good for you, I like that.
then you think it's.
I like it if you contribute to wish list too, by the way, which is the Republican counterpart, yeah.
So what, I'm not sure that once you get a woman candidate in, she's gonna be more tuned in to women's issues than her male but I was curious.
Yeah, I've done a lot of research on that, actually.
Really?
Yeah, I've done a fair amount of research on state legislatures and Congress, and yes, women do different things. They're more likely. I mean, the main areas in which women in office do different things are, these are not surprising. Policies related to women, benefiting, advancing the status of women in some way, benefiting women. Policies related to women's sort of, what you might consider women's traditional concerns is caregivers, so health care, education, children and families, policies on children and families. And women are more likely to give priority to those areas of legislation. They're more likely to be actively involved. So, so yes. And there's also evidence that even on gender neutral policies, that although it's fuzzy, it's not necessarily survey evidence, it's other kind of evidence, more qualitative evidence, that women's presence at the table raises different kinds of issues and can lead to more effective policy. Because women view policies from the perspective of their lives and their life experiences, they ask different questions about them, and it can lead to more effective policy solutions, ones that work better for everyone, the whole society. So on things that we may even think that are not, gendered, there's evidence that, having women present and it makes a difference. Now, that's not to say that every woman makes a difference. We all know the counterexamples, right? I mean, clearly there are women who don't identify, who basically are not doing those kinds of things. But the majority do, and the majority do for both of them.
If you take someone like Hillary Clinton, because she is aggressive, people hate her. A lot of people hate her. But that's the way she should be, if she wants to fight the rights.
Yeah, Hillary Clinton is controversial for a lot of reasons. Hillary Clinton seems to be the kind of person that people either love or hate. She's, people have strong feelings about her one way or the other.
But do you think because she breaks the stereotype?
I think it's because she broke, she broke a lot of stereotypes. I mean, she broke a lot of stereotypes. There are people who even dislike her because of the way she dealt with Bill Clinton, right? And the fact that she didn't get divorced. I know several people who still haven't forgiven her because she didn't divorce him, right? So, people have reactions to Hillary Clinton for a lot of different reasons. Some because she broke the stereotype of being a first lady. And if you think she broke it, wait till if she becomes first lady. Teresa Hines character. That'll be interesting. Yes.
I was wondering if there was any research on if there was a difference between the way men and women vote on voting in terms of the likability of a candidate. You hear people talk about, I could sit down and have a beer with this guy, which, that's how some people vote. I was wondering if there's a difference between women doing that and men doing that.
It's a really fascinating question, and there's, to my knowledge, very little research on it, which is kind of surprising. Because what it means to be likable, I think it's probably quite different. One could hypothesize that the women want to look for someone who can sit down and talk with them at the kitchen table about the issues and concerns, and the men want to go have a beer with the guy or something. One can imagine that they look for someone, maybe someone different qualities, or with the woman. They don't want to have a beer with a woman, right? Candidate. I don't know. But it's You just gave me a good research idea. Thank you. Yes.
Can you give us a quick opinion of what's going to happen in Florida? And
What's going to happen?
In Florida?
Florida? Oh.
And quick. And will the gender gap in Florida, in your opinion, will it be consistent with the gender gap that you're going to be looking for in other states? With all
Yeah.
the issues, involved.
You know, there was one the last time. I mean, the extent that we had, we had this, the networks have done these, they used to do their own exit polls. All the networks major media networks did their own exit polls, and then they pulled the resources into this voter news service. They decided instead of being competition, it was too expensive because they were all out there trying to scoop each other and make the calls first. So they developed this consortium. And then, of course, we had no exit polls in 2002 because in 2000, VNS screwed up badly. I mean, the voter news service, it just, But there was exit poll data that came out of there before they took it off the internet, before it disappeared. Off the internet, and you can actually still find it. And based on what we know about Florida in 2000, from the exit poll data and also the polls that were conducted just before the election, there was a gender gap in Florida, just as there was a gender gap in most other states. I suspect there'll be one again. But what's going to happen, in Florida, I have no idea. I don't think things are a lot better there. One of my closest political science friends is actually a political scientist at the University of South Florida, and she does not give me, she does a lot of commentating about and following up Florida politics, and she does not give me a lot of reason for hope. But it's not just Florida, it's throughout this country. Our election system is, our actual physical voting machines and procedures for voting are really a mess. I mean, the infrastructure for voting is just horrendous. I mean, we are like worse than a third world country when it comes to, in many ways, the way we vote and our infrastructure for it. We need to have people come here and monitor our elections. I think we need enormous amount of reform. And we've always resisted standardization in this country. Like every state does it differently. The localities do it differently. I mean, it's such a mishmash. So I think what happened in Florida, we may actually see in other states this year. That's my fear. It may not just be Florida. And there are absentee ballots. I mean, there are apparently record numbers of absentee ballots being filled out. There are all these overseas folks who didn't vote in 2000 who are now registered, who are now trying to vote. So there are going to be a lot of, if this election's really close, and it's close in the states, I think 2000, we could potentially end up with a situation where 2000 looks like it was a little wrinkle. Because I think there's the possibility for this to be worse. I mean, if it was really close, there's a possibility for more states to be hung up for days and days and days. So, I mean, hopefully it won't be that way, but I think the possibility is there. Yes.
I had read an article in the paper that in several states throughout the country that the Republicans were really intimidating some of the voters, so that they wouldn't, especially, I think it was in Florida actually, that there was a large group that always worked to get out the vote and to help, elderly or people who couldn't get to the polls, vote by mail and so forth. Do you think that kind of intimidation would affect male and female voters differently?
I don't know. I mean, I haven't really thought about voter intimidation. I mean, I think whether it would affect, whether it would have a differential effect on the basis of gender. What do you think? Do you think it would?
I don't know. I'm a female and I feel that I get angry and I want to make sure that I voted anyway, but then
Yeah.
I'm not here, so I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of worry about voter intimidation. I mean, certainly African American community is very worried about that, and that was a huge issue in Florida for the last election. So, there's a lot of concern about that. And then, of course, but it happens on the Democratic side too. We have the long history of Chicago. It always point to Chicago. It doesn't just happen necessarily one way. It can happen anywhere. Or New Brunswick, New Jersey, where I'm from. You can find it in New Brunswick, New Jersey too. It's happened there with local officials. Yes.
If there were a military draft again, do you think that would change the focus on certain issues, and do you think there would be any gender gap there?
Oh, yeah.
If women would be, more concerned about their sons being called into the military?
Yeah, I think no one's willing to talk about a draft.
Every once in a while,
Either side. There are rumors all over the internet, but Congress just took a vote to make clear that they're not, intending to institute a draft. Yeah, I mean, it would be unprecedented because now we would be drafting women as well as men. So it's really unprecedented in terms of how that would play out, and and what that would mean. But I think there'd be so much public opposition. I just don't even think I think there'd be so much public opposition to a draft at this point, just based on what we've heard already, that I don't think it's a viable, I just don't think it's a viable option for either party at this point. I hope I don't have to put that statement down.
I think we should take one more question.
Okay, there's a question all the way back up here.
Yeah, I know this is not exactly to do with gender issues, but in reference to the, you brought up the issue, or someone did, about the voting equipment across the country.
Yeah.
Through the Eagleton Center, have you gotten any information as to whether there's been any improvement made in the touchscreen equipment? And any kind of record that's going to be able to be kept of that?
As far as I know, that's a huge issue, and there isn't a paper record that's attached to it. I think it's not just it's a problem here in New Jersey where we use touch screens, but also
some parts of New Jersey too. Yeah,
some parts of New Jersey, but all over the country where they have touch screens as well. So, that's one of the major. So they replaced this old technology now with touch screens, but then there's no paper record, so you can't really do a recap, or you can't really go back and look at people's votes. And then there's the potential for fraud. Somebody gets in there and mucks around with them.
Because the hackers could probably get into that.
Probably. Yeah. There's all kinds of potential. There are just enormous potential problems, I think, around. This is not something, I'm not really an expert on this, but it's clear just based on the information I've seen that there's just enormous potential problems.
Well, they different.